The theme of today's lecture is Transcendence of Everyday Life. To understand the theme, the transcendence of everyday life, we're going to be relying upon the work of Henry Lefebvre, as well as an article on the Reichsbürgerbewegung, who we previously discussed this semester. However, before I get around to that, I'm going to unpack a quote from Orson Welles. We've talked about him a little bit this semester as well. If you don't remember the movie, The Trial, that is based on Franz Kafka's novel, which I showed a little bit of to help exemplify some of Weber's theorizing. Orson Welles was the director of that movie. So here we have a situation where Orson Welles was around 24 years old, and he had just delivered a radio program that was trying to convince those listening to it that there was an alien takeover. It was a radio program called War of the Worlds, and it was just a story about an alien takeover. But given its presentation, it had such an effect on people that it made them think that it was an actual news report on an ongoing alien takeover, and caused quite a bit of chaos and fear across the country. He was then confronted the next day by a room full of reporters, pictured here, to which he replied, "Well, every radio program tries to be more dramatic than life, as every play tries to be more dramatic than life, and every movie, not less so. I would have been surprised if, and hurt as anybody would if they've been told that a presentation was less effective than life." So it is precisely this sort of dramatizing of life that we are going to get into today with the theme Transcendence of Everyday Life, a matter that applies not only to, let's say, radio programs, but also film and plays, as Orson notes here, but also, as I will show, politics as well. So let's start off with the reading from Lefebvre. Henry Lefebvre argues that philosophers, and he says particularly Marxist philosophers, have wrongfully ignored the importance of everyday life. Marxist philosophers tend to be concerned with structural aspects of society, economic aspects of society. They'll have overlooked the importance of everydayness, as he puts it. Lefebvre tells us that the individual is often incurably bored and trapped within the framework of everyday life. This is so much the case that the individual does not truly have his or her own existence in their possession. If you could kind of see the Marxian logic in Lefebvre here. If you could think of, let's say, the concept of alienation as applied to the worker, Lefebvre is using this sort of externality of one's own existence as they relate to everyday routine. Literature and film, Lefebvre says, are often used as a means of escape from everyday life. It gives us a sense of what he calls the marvelous, this sort of higher aesthetic that is well above individual and everyday experience. There's this tendency for human beings to want to rise above their everyday lives, break away from their everyday lives, and have a sense of escape. But for Lefebvre, this rising above one's everyday life should not be escape, but rather a sort of Marxist liberation to transform one's everyday life. This is also a similarity that was with Theodor Adorno, who we discussed, in his views on leisure, if you recall. Lefebvre argues that drama is only understood in the higher rungs of politics. There is often dramaturgical analyses of politics, but these are often focused on politicians and the state, the very powerful parts of politics, but not, Lefebvre says, on everyday social life. He goes on to talk about how film provides an illusion of stepping outside of one's everyday life, but of course not one that is sufficient for the type of Marxist liberation that Lefebvre wishes would transform the everyday life rather than just temporarily escape from it. So, when speaking about this tendency among human beings to want to break apart from the mundane feelings that dictate everyday life, this operates in many different ways. Max Weber, when we were talking about the tensions between religion and those five spheres of society, the political, the economic, the intellectual, the aesthetic, and the erotic. We find this same type of breaking with everyday routine that is emphasized by Weber. I'm not going to go over all the examples from all five spheres, but here Max Weber's writings on the tension between salvation religion and the aesthetic sphere is applicable to the present discussion, where Weber writes, "Art takes over the function of a this-worldly salvation, no matter how this may be interpreted. It provides a salvation from the routines of everyday life, and especially from the increasing pressures of theoretical and practical rationalism. With this claim to a redemptory function, art begins to compete directly with salvation religion." Remember that much of these tensions revolve with religion as society modernizes comes from the competition that one of these spheres offers. And usually this type of competition could come in the form of a sense of transcendence or a sense of salvation. In the same way that an artistic product allows one to feel as if they have transcended their everyday life, it breaks apart from their everyday life. This used to be something that was more confined to religion in pre-modern societies, and thus the aesthetic sphere becomes in tension with religion. We also see this quality when we were discussing collective effervescence with Durkheim, where people live differently and more intensely than in normal times. They feel so elated by this fact that they even believe that they are communicating with and are taken over by a sacred realm, a type of realm of existence that they usually don't feel, such a realm of existence that is not compatible with the profane realm that dictates their everyday life. Breaking with routine connects to deeply existential needs as well as simple forms of human enjoyment. So, for those of you who have played sports, you know that some of your fondest memories in playing sports could be the feelings of adrenaline you've had, feelings of timelessness where a thing happens, you don't even really remember what happened. Professional athletes often, after they're interviewed after a big moment that they had, said that they blacked out and they can't recall what had happened. It's sort of completely different from, the much more aware perception that you have when you are walking about your daily routine, where you're very much stuck within this world. This sort of coming outside of one's everyday life is offered in sports. It's offered in film, where we transcend from our everydayness. The German poet Novalis has an understanding of poetry as a defense against ordinary life. Weber, when writing about the tensions between the erotic sphere and religion, writes about sexual intercourse, saying that it leads to a state in which one is liberated from, quote, "the cold skeleton hands of rational orders just as completely from the banality of everyday routine." So this is a dynamic that pervades virtually all matters of social life. This tendency to want to break away from one's everyday life is a very common tendency for the human being to find both just simple enjoyment, but also to fulfill their deeply existential needs. Lefebvre writes about Charlie Chaplin, who is particularly alluring to the viewer because Charlie Chaplin takes objects that are familiar to us and distorts them. He disorients us, he makes the familiar unfamiliar. And once we leave the cinema, Lefebvre writes, the darkness of the real world closes around us yet again. So this desire to break with one's everyday life is applicable to politics. We've discussed this with populist politics, with conspiracy theories within politics. So some of this will have some overlap from previous lectures. But there is a sort of monotony to everyday routine. If you remember from our lecture on conspiracy theories, boredom is strongly associated with conspiracy theories. There's a desire to create a new story because you are bored with the story of your life. Politics defines political situation. It creates stories. It provides stories of good versus evil, like many stories do. Um, the audience has this sort of long-awaited entrance into the political scene where politicians talk about how they're going to take down the establishment actors before them. If establishment actors before them created, let's say, political plays that are just imposed upon the audience for them to just watch, whereas let's say a more populist type of politician might say that the audience gets to enter the scene. This is also a way of transcending political routine. There is an attraction to certain political movements because it seems as if one is self-extending themselves into the story of politics rather than just being feeling powerless and subjected to politics. We talked about that as well with conspiracy theories. This sort of desire for empowerment comes from trying to live within a new story, a story that is different from the normal story that we have become accustomed to, that being where most individuals don't really have that much of a foundational effect of political decisions, at least at the higher rungs of politics. So we talked a little bit about the Reichsbürgerbewegung in Germany. I think this is a really clear example. We're going to dive into them a little bit more in more detail than in previous lectures today. This is a great example of how this desire for transcending one's everyday life manifests itself in political movements and particularly extremist and conspiratorial political movements such as the Reichsbürgerbewegung. As a reminder, the Reichsbürgerbewegung do not recognize the modern German state. The majority of them believe that the Third Reich is still the legitimate government of Germany, and they desire to overthrow the Federal Republic of Germany. We'll get a little bit more into the details on how that unfolded. There is a struggle against everyday life and what the concept of the losers of modernization, those who cannot, as a reminder, those who cannot keep up with the advancements of society, who want to reach for sources of control, often in the form of either extremist parties or conspiratorial parties, or both. The two are not mutually exclusive. They are able to project themselves into the larger story of politics and larger story of history rather than feel powerless and subjected to politics. An audience member can now become an actor with a new story if they just create a new story and reject the actual one unfolding. Conspiracy theories and extremist movements, of course, allow for this type of self-extension into the new political scene that is constructed by the conspiratorial mindset. Okay, so just for a little bit of detail on the Reichsbürgerbewegung, in 2022, 3,000 police officers and special forces raided 150 homes. One police officer was actually murdered during a raid of his home by one of the Reichsbürger members. There was this countrywide raid that was trying to stop what was known as Day X. Day X was the Reichsbürger's plot to storm the German capital and try to overthrow the government. They were going to kidnap the health minister and the chancellor at the time, Olaf Scholz, and they were going to tie up and present Scholz on national television and then murder him on national television to convince the German population that the Federal Republic of Germany was no longer the recognized government. In the raids of their homes, the police found many resources that the Reichsbürger had compiled. They had stored away these resources for the regime change. They found gold that amounted to €500,000. They had a massive arsenal of weapons, including 380 firearms, 350 other weapons like knives, axes, and also 150,000 rounds of ammunition, military helmets, and explosives as well. They were very much committed, and I wouldn't say, they were as prepared as they could be to be able to attempt the coup. So they were also recruiting soldiers actively to try to become a part of their new state's army, and they would have shooting practices in a forest behind a hunting lodge in Thüringen, which is a small East German state. They were tucked away in a hunting lodge in a nice spa town, Bad Lobenstein. Members of this movement were willing to take very extreme acts, and these acts, of course, led to very extreme criminal punishment, which is really quite telling that these individuals are willing to ruin their lives, ruin the what they have in their everyday life, for the sake of this story that they have created, this completely distorted reality that is distant from their everyday life. It suggests that they don't really see much value or any worth in their everyday routine and existence if they are willing to take some of the harshest punishment you can possibly get in order to break with your everyday life. That cost-benefit analysis is really telling. They want to become a warrior, so to speak. They want to take a role within this story, have a more central role within their conception of political life. And they were able to sort of combat the boring monotony of their everyday existence by creating a new type of existence where they get to fight on behalf of the morally pure forces of society, where they do not have to be just subjected to the rule of law, where they are going to take part in what they consider to be the good, righteous overthrow and be a central player within that overthrow. So this type of uprooting, this type of breaking from everydayness allows them to not just feel subjected to the actions of elite actors, but rather regain control by having a major effect on German society. It is a process of self-extension that happens with the construction of this story. It gives themselves a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose that they do not receive in their everyday lives. And it is a way in which they would have encountered this meaning and purpose that they assign to the way in which they would have encountered the social world that they have transformed. So, in this story of good versus evil, following the structure of many stories, they projected themselves into. They redirected their sense of everyday life. Their objectives on an everyday basis were not, simple, let's say, career goals or even more monotonous, errands or whatever. These were all uprooted by a completely different objective, that is to overthrow the German state. They plotted secretly in a tucked-away lodge, giving a sort of dramatic allure to it, a story-like allure. Being a central player in the new regime in training for this probably is quite exciting and gives a sort of story-like account to one's everyday life that they did not have before. It's of course it might sound a little bit odd, but in the same way that one is attracted to a story and that it is entirely different from the nature of one's everyday life, often at least, individuals were also able to have a sort of fantasy structure dominate their existence in this way. They give themselves a sense that they're no longer ordinary citizens fumbling about within the tedious confines of everyday life, but they rather enter into a more meaningful realm of existence in which they are fighting in the service of a cause against the corrupt elite. If you do not remember, I'll just briefly remind you that belief in conspiracy theories are associated with exaggerating one's self-importance and the need to feel unique in comparison to others. This form of narcissism is linked to individuals when individuals feel that their self-worth has not received adequate external validation. The desire to enter a larger-than-life story in which one plays a more important role than they would in their everyday routine intensifies one's sense of self-importance and legitimates their value in a society that denies it. Again, you might remember this sort of desire to feel special, to have access to information that others don't. They believe that they have an understanding of rare, important information that the majority of the population doesn't. And through this, they are able to satisfy these sort of narcissistic impulses to be able to feel special relative to others. Typical ordinary citizens, they think, remain sort of duped by a secret elite, by this sort of illegitimate government. They're very ignorant and they're just stumbling about this boring everyday life, whereas the Reichsbürger, in their view, are fighting the real fight, the good fight, the important fight, the dramatic fight. They live a more dramatic reality, a more fulfilling reality, where only they are among the few who understand what is quote unquote really going on in the sort of composition of German politics and German society. So at the core of these dispositions rests this yearning for meaning, which exceeds the existential fulfillment that one can be found in one's everyday life. It is this disposition to transcend one's everydayness that is essential to not only forms of mild enjoyment, as we discussed before with either literature or film, which aren't necessarily only mild enjoyment, but they could be. But it also enters into major political situations as well.